Sorry, there's a bit of functionality here this time that's a little bit different than what I'm used to. So maybe I'll just start this off and dive us into this by talking a little bit about Parker as we kick this off. So I think a lot of people on this call know Parker already or have read Parker's work. And then there are many people dialing in from different parts of the world where this is the first time that they're getting a chance to be exposed to Parker's work. So Parker has a very long and distinguished background. Part of that is a doctorate, which he pursued at Berkeley, and then basically walked away from that to become a community organizer. And that's been what he's been committed to for much of his life, and which took different forms, including the founding of the Center for Courage and Renewal. And for us, it's a great pleasure to have Parker joining us because he is one of our elders, one of the extraordinary elders in the world, an elder of the Quaker community as well. So that's a bit about him. I think for me, one of the things that I find most touching about Parker is the presence. Part of that is the voice, part of that's a sense of humor, and part of that is also what he's able to share about some of the most difficult places and spaces that we can walk in as human beings, including those places that can be dark or where there is darkness. And so, Parker, thank you for joining us. And maybe we could start you off, as many of us are in a context where we're experiencing difficult feelings or a mix of feelings that are new for many of us or new for all of us. Maybe we could ask you about your thoughts in this moment in time.
Right. Well, thank you, Aaron. And can you hear me okay? The sound is breaking up a bit on my end. How am I on your end?
You're coming through well. Thank you for asking, Parker.
Good. Well, again, I'm just very grateful to be with this community of activists who are so deeply engaged with what's going on in our world right now. I live in Madison, Wisconsin, and I'm in a relatively safe part of that world. My wife and I have been sheltering in space in our home for almost a month, partly because I'm 81 and I have underlying conditions that put me at high risk. And that's a topic I'd like to return to later, which has to do with an opportunity really presented by this crisis for people like me to identify with folks who live their whole lives at high risk, not because of coronavirus, but because of all kinds of social factors, race, religion, nationality, structural poverty, et cetera, et cetera. And I name those things because I know those are the contexts in which you are deeply immersed. I'll just say briefly about myself, given Aaron's cues, that I thought I was going to be pursuing an academic career when I was in my 20s. I got a PhD at the University of Berkeley in the 1960s. And that, of course, was a time of, for a lot of people, including me. By 1969, when I got my degree, I looked around me, had around for several years, and saw that a variety of social crises were coming to a head. Vietnam was raging. My heroes had been assassinated, and the cities were burning. And so I walked away from academia to become a community organizer in Washington, D.C., working on issues of racial justice and equity. From there, after 5 years, I went to what I thought was a sabbatical at an intentional Quaker Philadelphia, where I ended up spending 11 years. It was a very long sabbatical. I moved in there with my family and became Dean of Studies at this adult study center. And while there's a lot to say about my Pendle Hill experience, I want to just say this, that there I was immersed in Quaker faith and practice and the historic traditions of nonviolence that have flowed from it. And so it was a new kind of education for me that wasn't so much about the externals of social change, but about the inner life of people engaged in social change, because you really can't do nonviolence without some serious inward searching and a kind of continual awareness of your own inner dynamics. Lots to say from that point onward, but I'll conclude with just a couple of remarks. As Erin said, in the early 90s, I founded the Center for Courage and Renewal, whose job in the world is to create safe spaces for the soul. And if the word soul doesn't work for you, that's just fine, because it's one of those words that points towards something which has no name. It's called different things in different traditions. In secular humanism, it's called identity and integrity. Thomas Merton called it true self out of the Catholic mystical tradition, et cetera, et cetera. Closest I've ever been able to come is the being and human being, to identify it a little more precisely. And our work at the Center for Courage and Renewal is to help people rejoin soul and role by creating safe spaces where basically people can tell the truth. They can get in closer touch with the imperatives of their soul, or what it is that their identity and integrity is wanting from them, from us, from you and me. And I'd be glad later to talk about that the processes we use, the circles of trust in which we gather to help that happen. And one final note, as Erin mentioned, I've tried in my writing and speaking to be honest about the shadow side of all of this, because there's a tendency, I'll just speak for myself, and it was certainly true in my earlier years, to think of what I was doing as some kind of nobility, when in fact it's fraught with dangers and can often lay one low. And I would be very surprised if there aren't people in the 250 plus folks who are gathered on this call who aren't feeling laid low right now. I have my own version of that as a person at high risk who's also very troubled by the politics around all of this. And as a result of those dynamics and the work I set out to do when I was in my late 20s, I have, in fact, gone into 3 deep dives of clinical depression. And while those have been extraordinarily dark times in my life, 2 in middle age and 1 when I got into my mid-60s, they have also been profound learning times. And so it's natural, I guess, for me to look at the darkness in which we're now immersed and ask myself, what's to be learned here? What's to be learned about myself, about other people, about the structures in which we live, and about my relationship to all of that at home and abroad. It turns out that Erin and I share a favorite quote from a book called The Once and Future King by T.H. White, where Merlin, the magician, is talking to the young Arthur. He's grooming him to be the future king. And in a very moving passage, Merlin says to the young Arthur, among other things, learning is the thing for you. You know, you may find your world devastated by evil lunatics, he says. You may find your dearest love lost and gone. whatever it may be, learning is the thing for you. I think he says, learn how the world wags and what wags it. And the first time I ran across that, I took great inspiration from it. And so constantly in moments like this, in personal and public life, I think what's really most therapeutic for me is trying to learn what I can, even though some of those lessons are hard.
Parker, thank you. And I also want to say thank you to everyone on the call that's trying to make the best out of this, because it looks like there are some people that are having a good experience and some people where this is coming through in a bit of a scratchy way. I appreciate that everyone's turned off their videos as well. And so thank you for that, everyone. And Parker, it looks like your video is moving again, which is great. Parker, I was wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit more about an examined life, and also about being with difficult feelings and emotions in this time.
Sure. Well, I you know, among my learning moments in life was back in college, I guess, learning the Socratic maxim, the unexamined life is not worth living. And I remember a few years later adding to that maxim a maxim of my own, which is, if you choose to live an unexamined life, please do not take a job that involves other people. It became very clear to me, because of various jobs I had and various leaders under whom I suffered, along with a lot of other people, that an unexamined life gets projected onto other folks in unfortunate and often destructive ways. And so I think I've written some about leadership as being an opportunity to either cast a lot of light or cast a very long shadow in which other people live, and corollary to that, the importance of self-care for leaders. One of the things that I try to remember constantly is that self-care is not selfish. Whatever you can do to care for true self, not for your ego image, but for your true self, is ultimately being done on behalf of those whose lives you touch. And so I try to pay attention to self-care. And in a time like this, where so much is swirling around us, where things are frightening and confusing and saddening and maddening, I think the first thing that I have to do is to acknowledge the whole range of emotions that are churning inside of me, and not pretend that I've got this under control or got myself under control in this context, because day by day, I move in and out of thinking I see a little light and then I'm back into the darkness. And I think it's this awareness and honesty about the mix that I believe we all are. I certainly am, a complicated mix that I sometimes want to deny, but I deny it at my peril. So I think simple awareness of that, and the presence of at least one or two other people to whom you can acknowledge that complexity, with whom you can be honest about your feelings, your fears, your hopes, the whole, as we say here in Wisconsin, the whole kielbasa, the whole 9 yards, the whole range of emotions, from very negative to very positive. That's one way that our circles of trust try to serve leaders, by creating safe spaces for them to tell their soul's own truth. And I think we'll be talking a little bit later about some of the things that make for a circle of trust. I think our friends at the Wellbeing Project are going to provide a link to a write-up about circles of trust from the website of the Center for Courage and Renewal. And I'll just quickly mention that I wrote a book about circles of trust called A Hidden Wholeness. So for me, that's step one. And from there, you can go out the hub of from the hub of a very complex wheel. You can go out in 360 degrees of direction to whatever it is that you need or want to work on first. I'll just say this about my experience of depression, which again comes back as a powerful learning time for me. I think at first when I experienced depression and came out of it through a process I still don't understand, just by good fortune, I think, and a big degree of happy accident, I imaged it as being lost in the dark. But later on, especially in my second experience of depression, I realized that that was not an honest description of depression at its depths. It was more like becoming the dark, so that you and the darkness are fused. You are one. You are the darkness is you. There's a big difference between those two states, because if you're simply lost in the dark, there is a difference between you and the darkness. And you can grope around in it, and you can feel, oh, there's a door handle here, even though the door won't open, or there's a window frame here, even though the window is blocked. But at least you can begin to wander around, touch some things, work with some things, and maybe find some point of leverage on your condition or some opening in it. But when you've become the darkness, you have no leverage. There's no distance between the depression. And so the learning process for me is what keeps me focused on being lost in the dark, so that I can learn enough to not slide into that state of becoming the dark. And I'm glad to talk about details about some of the things I learned about that, if anybody would like. Again, circles of trust have been enormously helpful for me, although there are times in the depths of depression when you simply I couldn't be with other people. But when I was well enough to sit in circle with others, these practices that create safe space allowed me to tell my truth about what I was or wasn't finding in some very healing ways.
Parker, thank you. And just for people that have joined into the call as well, Parker is sharing with us about being with difficult feelings, especially at this moment in time where so much of that is present for us in different ways around the world and in waves that are coming through. So just as context for people that are dropping into the call. Parker, a follow-up question to what you just talked about. Would you be able to share a little bit about exploring in the darkness, but not becoming the dark?
Sure. Let me just give you one very concrete example, because I know how many people right now are feeling thwarted and ineffective, and somehow at about 5% of their normal functioning. And I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of us on a call like this, a lot of us who play roles in life of the sort we play, we're were tagged early on in life as high functioning people, people who could make a difference, people who could get results. And at some level, often unconscious, we have tended to define ourselves by that capacity. And so when we go from 100% or 90 or 80% effectiveness down to 5 or less, as happens in a crisis like this, which affects every aspect of our lives, we lose our sense of self. We lose our identity. We don't know who we are anymore. And stay there too long, it's very devastating. So I've lifted up that feature of our lives right now, or many of our lives, because I want to talk about one practice that I learned during depression. And then I want to say a word about the standard that we call effectiveness. Aaron, if you'll help me remember. Because one thing about being 81 is you just forget stuff. I'm there. So in my depression, I learned a very simple practice. And that was the practice of keeping a daily journal that didn't look anything like journals I had kept before, which were full of paragraphs and pages and mini essays about this or that topic that I was struggling with or thinking about. In depression, you can't write a paragraph or a page. But what I could do was to keep a journal of daily, small events that I needed to be alert to and that I needed to note, because by that afternoon or the next day, I would have forgotten them. For example, I have a journal where on a given day, it starts, I got up at 10 o'clock this morning instead of 11:30, which is when I got up yesterday. I know that because I can see yesterday's page in this journal right in front of me. I got up at 10:30 this morning. I got dressed at 2. Yesterday I didn't get dressed at all. I just stayed in my pajamas in a darkened room. On another day, I got out and rode my bike for 10 minutes instead of the 5 minutes I had ridden it the day before. And so I think you get the point, and you can multiply it many times over. I learned to value small achievements. And there are some of us who've spent our lives looking for the next big hit, and who only honor times when you have to treasure the small achievements. And I want to recommend that kind of practice highly. That, Aaron, in direct response to your question, a practice of that sort helped me be lost in the dark rather than becoming the dark. Because to become the dark is to lose your sense of self. And one of the ways you lose your sense of self, you let yourself be annihilated, is that you no longer have the markers that you've lived your whole life by to say, I am a self, I am someone, I am doing something that's worth doing. When you're there, it's worth getting up an hour early or riding your bike 5 minutes more when you're in that dark place. And it helps get you helps you get leverage on the darkness. The one more thing about this effectiveness issue that I mentioned a moment ago. I'm in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm in middle America. I'm in the midst of American culture as it applies to a white, straight, well-educated male person like me. That's the perspective from which I speak. That's the skin in which I've lived my life. And I'm very well aware of the limitations of that and my need to reach out, reach out, reach out. So I speak only for myself here, but I live in a culture which emphasizes the absolute centrality of effectiveness. And effectiveness in this quarter, or this week, or this day, constantly measured in whatever work I've done by how effective is this work? How many copies has that book sold? How much how is the Center for Courage and Renewal doing in terms of measuring up to its mission standards? And I'm not going to, I don't want to dismiss effectiveness. We all want to be effective with our work. But there are times like this when something comes very clear that I think should be clear to us all the time. None of us is going to die. None of us who has devoted his or her life to love, truth, and justice and similar goals is going to die being able to say, I'm sure glad I devoted my life to that, because now everyone in the world can check it off their to-do list. There are goals that cannot be accomplished, not only in your lifetime or my lifetime, but in anybody's lifetime. There are goals that are forever receding into the future. And yet they are the most important goals to give ourselves to. And so the question becomes, how do we stay on that path? How do we sustain ourselves in pursuing those goals when we can't possibly measure up to the demand of producing a first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter result that blows people away? And my answer to that is, we need a higher standard. Without throwing out effectiveness, we need a higher standard, and my name for it is faithfulness. I don't mean anything high and mighty by that. I mean faithfulness to my own gifts, faithfulness to the needs I perceive around me, and faithfulness to finding ways in which my gifts can intersect those needs, while always understanding that I can't take care of everybody and everything, and I must take care of myself. So part of being faithful is cutting yourself some slack, and part of being faithful is teaming with other people where you can multiply the service in community, rather than feeling that you have to bear this whole load alone. So a practice, I believe this is a practice, is to reframe your life, your work, and subsume that effectiveness standard under a higher standard, faithfulness. Because one more thing, I know what happens, and you know what happens too, if effectiveness becomes the only or dominant measure of our work. We simply take on smaller and smaller tasks because they're the only ones with which you can be effective. So if we are interested in contributing to love, truth, and justice, faithfulness, it seems to me, is critical, or we simply won't stay the course.
Thank you, Parker. Just for everyone to know, we're collecting questions for Parker in the chat. There are two wonderful members of our team, Alice and Jimena, that are collecting these questions and will be translating these to Parker through this call. Parker, I'm going to use the next question as a bridge to talking about circles of trust. And so the bridge question taking us there is about, how do we reach out to others for help when we are in those dark places as well? Sometimes for those of us in this community who are so oriented to giving, it can be hard to ask for help and to receive.
Yeah, I thank you for the question. I closely identify with it because it was, it took me a long time to overcome my image as the helper rather than the helped. And so I know some of that struggle inwardly. And I also think that I have to be honest about myself, is that there was a big element of pride involved in that. I don't need help. And yet suddenly I find myself in a situation where I desperately need help. And depression, it became for me a life and death issue. Because in my depressions, I spent many days wondering if this was the day to relieve myself of all that pain. So I think, again, we have to understand our inner dynamics. And since it's difficult to understand your inner dynamics when you're lost in the dark and you're looking more for an escape hatch than for self-examination, this is ongoing life work to get in touch with those elements of yourself that would block you in time of crisis from asking for what you need. I want to say just a couple of other things, though, that I think maybe take us a little deeper. One is that when it comes to the things of the inner life, which I know many of you are trying to offer the folks you work with, as well as the external goods and services they don't have. But when it comes to offering the gifts of the inner life, and that includes compassion and love and affirmation and blessing, whatever the words you use may be, with gifts of that sort, you cannot give them if you can't receive them. That was a hard thing for me to start to understand, but I think was finally what took me into asking for help with inner dynamics that I didn't understand and that were really death dealing for me. And I started to understand in that critical moment that if I wanted to do life-giving things for other people, I had to be willing and able to receive life-giving stuff for myself. You can't give what you don't have, and you can't give what you're unwilling to receive. Why should anybody trust me to give love or affirmation if they perceive that I can't receive it for myself? Why would they trust me to give them anything of humble value if they perceive me as someone whose self-image is of the guy on the white horse who rides in to rescue the downcast? I have to be of the people, and that means being of humanity. And I have to acknowledge that I share this human condition. And then one more thing, which is really a huge subject, and I won't go into it at length, but those of us who offer help to people in crises like depression, I think we have to understand that the most significant help we can give is simply unafraid presence. There aren't any words that would have brought me out of depression. There aren't any magic tricks. There aren't any therapeutic techniques. But there were one or two people who weren't afraid of me. They weren't approaching me as if depression were contagious. And here again is a concrete story about what one of those people did. This man, about 10 years older than I, after asking my permission, came to my house every afternoon about 4 o'clock, quietly, silently almost, sat me down in an easy chair in my living room, took off my shoes and socks, and massaged my feet for about half an hour. He rarely said a word. He was another Quaker, and there are silent Quakers. He rarely said a word, but occasionally he would say, "I feel your struggle today." And that would be it. Or, "I feel you're a little stronger today. I sense you're a little stronger today." He wasn't looking for a conversation, and I trusted his intuitions because he had had this amazing intuition about how he could connect with me in a part of my body when it was impossible to connect anywhere else. Depression is a totally isolating experience. And you're disconnected from others. That's what's so terrifying about it. And here was a fellow who just instinctively realized that I might be able to feel something through a foot massage, and he offered it to me. So the quality of help we give, I liken, I liken this kind of help to sitting at the bedside of a dying person, which many of us have done. And in that moment or that period of time, you don't have any tips, tricks, and techniques. You don't have any fixes. All you can offer is your quiet, abiding, unafraid presence, which I believe communicates to the other person. I have no way of knowing this for sure, but I believe it communicates to the other person a simple confidence, your confidence, that they can make this journey and that you can witness it with them in an unafraid and compassionate way. No word may be passed, but that kind of presence makes a difference. So maybe we would ask for help more often if more of us knew what kind of help to give. But the last thing I want when I'm in that dire situation is somebody rushing in and saying, hey, I heard you're down and out. Well, let me say, there's a book you ought to read that would fix you right up, or there's a diet you ought to go on, or there's an exercise you ought to do, or that happened to my uncle and here's what he did. I'm sure it'll help you. None of that is helpful. In fact, it's all of it, when it happened to me, made me more depressed and feel more isolated.
Parker, there's this.
Wrong device. Parker, there's this wonderful phrase that you have as well for all of us. And it was something that came up as we were preparing for the session that I thought was such a wonderful thing to share, especially with those of us that can be helpers. And I'm trying to help bring this up. Do you remember the one about welcoming people?
Sure. Well, what I told Aaron when he and Jimena and Alice and I were preparing for this call is I said, the best words that I've ever heard when I've taken a serious problem to someone else for honest, open discussion is that person listens deeply for a long while, maybe asks some open, honest questions to help me dig deeper into what I'm trying to say. But in the end, in one way or another, that person says to me, welcome to the human race. And what that does, of course, is to say, you're one of us. You're part of the human condition, and this isn't something that sets you apart. This isn't something that makes me afraid of you. This isn't something that makes me think you're strange or difficult or scary. This is welcome to the human race. And as a result of that, I've always wanted, eventually, when it was the right thing to say to other people the best words I know, welcome to the human race.
And those feel like beautiful words just to take in as well. I know for me, like just hearing that allows me to feel more settled. Thank you, Parker. I want to acknowledge all the questions and the sharings that are happening in the chat, because there are people that are sharing really vulnerable things as part of this, and just so everyone knows, those are seen, and we'll also look at how we can weave those in, and if not, follow up afterwards. I also want to say that this is not the last session that we'll be hosting with Parker. We have a treat that's planned for a few weeks from now, which will be Parker and Sharon Salzberg together, actually doing a session as a combination. So there'll be more space and time for us to explore with both of these wonderful elders. With the time we have left, I was hoping that we might be able to open up space, Parker, for you to talk about circles of trust. And maybe I'll just share from a personal perspective. In my community of friends, we use some of the Quaker techniques, and they're just absolutely extraordinary in the way they allow us to hold space tenderly for our vulnerable selves. So Parker, maybe you could share a bit about Circle of Trust with us.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. I want to acknowledge, of course, that in these days of social distancing, we can't sit in a circle of 25 people. Although I have to believe that some of you are working in situations where the technology doesn't exist to have online relationships or conversations. And I'm sure you're working hard on creative workarounds for that. But for those of us who do have the technology, I'll just say that you can do this on Zoom or other communication platforms, this Circle of Trust stuff, some of it anyway, until we're able to get together again. So before the pandemic, and I think from here on out it will be before the pandemic and after the pandemic, and there may be some good that comes out of that. I certainly hope so, and if it does, it will be folks like those on this call helping to create it. But before the pandemic, our model involves gathering about 25 people in the helping professions or the serving professions, teachers and healthcare workers and nonprofit leaders, for example. About 25 people in a circle in a room with a facilitator. The model of retreat that we like to offer when it's possible is a long-term experience for those same 25 people, quarterly retreats across a 2-year period, each of those retreats being 2.5 or 3 days each. So it's a lot of exposure for those 25 folk. And the facilitator is there to guide us with some ground rules, really to hold the boundaries of what creates a circle of trust. And as I talk about this, I can't mention everything that we do, but again, a book called A Hidden Wholeness that I wrote details a lot of what a circle of trust is all about. But one of the basic ground rules with which we begin, and I'm thinking now about you imagining doing this with even just a few colleagues, is a ground rule that says, whatever gets mentioned in here, whatever problem gets brought up, whatever question gets posed, whatever struggle someone shares, there shall be no fixing, no saving, no advising, and no correcting each other. And typically when we announce that at the beginning of a 2-year series of 3-day retreats on a quarterly basis, somebody will say, well, what in heaven's name are we going to do for the next 2 years? You've just taken away everything we like to do and know how to do. And it's true. And that's why we've taken it away. Because our default method of being with each other is to hear a problem and to say, I know how to fix that or save you or correct you or advise you. And when we do that, we stop listening to the other person, and that person's most important stops listening to themselves. A circle of trust is designed to help people listen more deeply to themselves. to get down to what Quakers call the inner teacher. And again, that has a variety of names and a variety of traditions. I think ultimately the inner teacher is what Socrates was referring to when he said, the unexamined life is not worth living. And these negative ground rules, thou shalt not fix, save, advise, or correct each other, actually clear the decks of a lot of things that are off-putting to the soul and to us. Because how many times have you walked out of a, quote, problem-solving conversation around a personal issue for you and feeling, I really wasn't heard. I really wasn't received. It had become an opportunity for someone else to show me how smart they are, rather than for me to really dig into an inner issue around which I have inner resources. If someone could please help me evoke them and call them up. So in that context, people share, and the response, instead of a fix, save, piece of advice, or a correction, the response is some silence to make sure we've heard what was said, and then an honest, open question. Honest, open questions are questions of the sort that help hear us into deeper speech. It's a phrase from Nell Morton that I love. Here, our task is to hear others into speech, or deeper speech. And when I'm asked an honest, open question around something I've just said, a question that the questioner is not sitting there thinking, I know the right answer to this, and I sure hope you give it to me. I'm given an opportunity to peel back a little bit what I was trying to say, because we all say stuff that about which we don't understand the full import. So the question, have you thought about seeing a therapist, is not an honest, open question. Or have you read this book, or have you tried this diet, is not an honest, open question. Those are little speeches in disguise that happens with our questioning all the time. And they're really advices that we want to give the other person under the guise of a question. So in our retreats, we do a lot of practice around what constitutes an honest, open question. So someone speaks about a hard experience they're having in this very moment. An honest, open question might be, have you ever had an experience like this, anything like this in your life before? I can't ask that question thinking, I know the right answer to this, and I sure hope you give it to me, because it's an honest, open question. And if the person responds with, yes, I have, and tells a bit about it, the next question might invite that person to explore that experience a little bit. What were the dynamics behind that, do you think, that collision or crash? And the next question might invite the person to think about things they learned from that experience that might be applicable in the present moment. And as you can see, all of that is within the inner life of the other person, and you aren't trying to import something to or export something into that life. You're simply evoking that person's inner resources. So that's, I would call that one of the key modules of the Circle of Trust approach, which is easily adaptable to certain parts of a staff meeting, where instead of doing problem solving, you are building a community, but I call it a community of solitudes, a community where people are supported in inner search in a way that rarely happens in community. There are a bunch of other modules as well, but being aware of our time limits, let me just stop there for the moment.
Parker, thank you. So I guess like a couple of reflections as we come close to the end of this. One is that we've continued to receive really beautiful questions that emerge from what you're sharing, and also really personal sharings as people reflect on this. And again, I think one thing that we'll say is that this series will continue, will hold these questions as precious and bring them into the next session with Parker, and I'll come back to that in just a second. In the webinar that we did before, we invited people a number of times to share into the chat beyond questions, things that they were feeling, ideas that they had. In this particular case, and this may be a personal bias, the place that I was sort of drawn to was really listening to Parker and just taking that in. And so Parker, I want to say thank you to you for being present with us. It's just such an extraordinary gift that you share with us in being present with us. And then in terms of the circle of trust, we'll share a link into the chat from the Center for Courage and Renewal that will help people put this together as well for themselves, and so they can experiment with it. And it really is a beautiful way to hold ourselves with tenderness and care and with the kind of safety we need for our very precious and vulnerable selves. And so just to take us to closing, and for a last piece that we can sit with for maybe a minute or two, Parker, I'm wondering if you might be able to, one more time, welcome us into the human race and allow us to sit with that reflection for a tiny moment, and then we'll close.
Well, I'd be glad to do that, Aaron. Let me just say a couple quick closing things first. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It really is an honor to be with people who are doing such important work in the world, and I know that everybody on this call fits that description. So thank you for this. It's energizing and encouraging and empowering for me. And I also want to say that if somebody wanted to put together some kind of compilation of some of the key questions and comments that have come in, or some kind of weaving of that into a document that would serve as a springboard for a next session, I'd be glad to do that session. As you know, I've been following the project for quite a while, the Wellbeing project, and I have always been intrigued with what it's doing. And so I have a pretty strong sense of who I'm sitting with here. So I'll just put out a blank check for if you want to add that session to the repertoire, or do it in the context of one of the sessions we already have scheduled. I'm game.
Parker, thank you. We will take you up on that, and maybe I'll just do this to close really quickly and then ask you to close us out. So next week, we're going to do a webinar with David White, the poet, and David will be building on the themes that Parker has talked about here and helping host us with poetry. And then we'll be coming back to Parker and Sharon in the weeks to come and following up on the questions here. Parker, thank you so much. Sarah, thank you for hosting us as well today. And Parker, maybe we can invite you to close us out, and especially with that welcome.
Just want to say to all the good folks on this call, whatever you're struggling with, whatever is fearful for you right now, whatever makes you feel like you're falling short of your own mark, welcome to the human race. These are the broken places where we join. These are the places that Leonard Cohen wrote about in that great song, those great lyrics: ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's where the light gets in. So let there be light.